Kris Cook.
Thanks. I want to give a shout out to the guy who came out and fixed the microphone. I'm an aircraft maintainer. I've been retired for 18 years now, but I still think of myself as a maintainer. And when the equipment breaks, you fix it. My call sign in the Air Force for years was "Fix It." My email is now "Fix It." So, thank you, sir. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this evening as you celebrate nearing the end of an academic year, and for many of you, your undergraduate days at the Y. That's a huge milestone, and I congratulate you on your success and achievements. Dr. Magley, thank you. Thank you for your gracious invitation. Thank you. Now can you hear me? I also want to thank Julie Radel, who was so helpful in answering all of my questions. You made the details very easy. And I want to give a special shout out to my family and friends who are here tonight. All three of my sisters are here. When I discovered I had breast cancer, I was stationed in Phoenix, Arizona. I had a surgeon who walked in and stood as far away from me as he could in the room with his arms folded and said, "You have breast cancer, you're scheduled for a mastectomy in 2 days," and walked out of the room. True story. I didn't like that answer. I at least wanted him to answer my questions. And I called my sisters. And all three of them jumped in the car and drove from Salt Lake and areas close by and drove to Phoenix that night to be with me and to take me with them to the University of Arizona in Tucson, where I saw cancer specialists who said, "Lumpectomy, radiation. What's the matter with your surgeon? How many years is he out of date?" They're great. My sisters are here. Their spouses are here. My great niece and her new spouse are here. I'm so delighted you're here. And my neighbors, who are friends and supporters. I love you guys very much, and I'm really grateful that you traveled tonight to be here. You know, the subject, I'm going to get rid of my glasses. You don't need them, and it's just going to make noise. The subject of my talk tonight is "The Road Not Taken," the poem by Robert Frost. And if you'll indulge me, I'll read that to you. "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though, as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first one for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever be back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere, ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. When I was younger, I would look at successful people and think, I bet they made their career choices very carefully, logically planning. That may have been true for them, it was not true for me. I certainly took the road less traveled, but as you listen, you'll see my paths were most often U-turns and detours rather than carefully planned. I came to the Y and I intended to go to a law school, but I got so tired of being a poor student and never having any money. And I thought, in my senior year, mind you, decided I'm going to get a degree in education, and took all my education classes in 1 year. Just bang, 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 bang. And thought, I'll teach, and I'll save some money, and then I'll go to law school. So I graduated in 1971, and Utah schools weren't hiring anyone. In fact, they were closing districts. I had a summer job, but I didn't have another job, and we didn't have the internet. It wasn't like you could see where jobs were available. But using some programs to help you find a job here at the Y, I found one in New York, and I was going to work in the New Hampshire in the summer, so I drove out, interviewed, and they said, "We think you'd be a good fit for us. We'll hire you, but we can't give you a contract yet, because we're still negotiating salaries with the teachers union, and we can't finish that until we get those salaries locked in. So we'll call you. You should have a contract by July." July came, the end of August came, my summer job ended, and I didn't have a contract. So I called the district, and they said about that. We paid a little bit more to the union for the contracts we had, and we don't have enough money to fund your position. So, sorry. Okay, I have a new car. I don't have very much money. And my sister Sandy, who's here tonight, said, "Come on down to Modesto. The canneries are hiring, and you can make some good money. They pay pretty good." So I did. And I started working 12-hour shifts in a cannery, sorting peaches. Now I want you to imagine a 4-foot wide conveyor belt, and overhead are cans, empty cans, going on their way to get stuffed with the fruit that we were canning. And they make a lot of noise. And you're looking at peaches. And if you've never worked in a cannery, the most expensive peaches are peach halves. So everybody wants to have you make as many peach halves as you can. But as the fruit came down, if it was bruised or there was part of the pit attached to the peach, then that went into bins for peach slices. And if it was really damaged, it went to fruit cocktail. I'm just saying, I don't eat that stuff. So after 3 weeks, my supervisor moved me without explanation to the end of the line. Now, conveyor belts are 4 feet wide, and they're moving down, and at the end, they turn over and they run back so they can come down again. And if you don't get all the peaches off the belt, they're going to be on the floor. It was the place for the most experienced person, but for whatever reason, she moved me down there. And nobody said anything, and we worked until our first break, and after the first break, I came back, and suddenly that peach conveyor belt was loaded with hundreds of peaches, and they were all right in front of me. And I'm going, and I'm trying to put them into some kind of bin. And I look up, somebody hits the emergency button, the belt stops, I look up, and everybody else on that line is standing with their arms folded, looking at me, smiling. They weren't sorting peaches. It was a union shop, and seniority mattered. Status, pay, all those kinds of things mattered. And I was the rookie, and they weren't having it. So we cleaned up, 15 minutes or so. My supervisor said, "We're moving you to stewed tomatoes." Yeah, okay. So I moved to stewed tomatoes. I knew a little bit more about organizational culture, but I didn't think about that at the time. The stewed tomatoes were already cooked, and they would roll down, and our job was to grab them really quickly and take their skins and go, and the tomato fruit would land on the belt, and we would take the skins and throw them in a bin. In 12 hours of doing that, tomatoes are really acidic, so my arms and my hands were covered with a rash. And I said to my supervisor, "If I wear gloves tomorrow, will that be okay?" "Oh, no. No, that slows down the process. No gloves on the line." If you went online tonight and looked for motivational quotes about never quitting, you'd find a million of them. And I say nobody who wrote one of those quotes about not quitting ever worked on a stewed tomato line. I finished out that week. That was a month of the cannery, and I went back to job hunting. And that hunt started me on a very diverse road. at an Air Force recruiting station, actually an Armed Forces recruiting station. And I was talking about careful choices in planning your career. So I walked into the office. I knew I didn't like wearing green, so the Army and Marine Corps were out. That wasn't a choice. I really liked the Navy uniforms. They were great. He was busy. So the Air Force guy was the one I talked to. And he said, you know, I've had 7 people try for officer training school, OTS, and none of them have been accepted, 7 women. And he said, why didn't you go to ROTC? And I had to explain to him that ROTC was not open to women until the 1969-70 school year, and it was only at 4 universities, and BYU wasn't one of them. So I went through a battery of tests, both physical and mental, to kind of figure out if I was qualified for the job, whatever that job was going to be. I was told it'd take a few months, and it did, and I found other employment. I was working in an elementary school, teaching remedial arithmetic to first graders. I didn't know anything about remedial arithmetic, but it was okay because they didn't either. This story is important to me, and I'm going to tell it to you. It's not in my notes, but I'm still going to tell it. So we have identified 6-year-olds, and I talked to some people tonight, and you said you were going to be elementary school teachers. So when 6-year-olds get outside of a classroom, they're usually excited. They're running around. These 6-year-olds were walking to this remedial class, and their heads were down, and they were just plodding along because we'd already told them they were failures. So they got to my class, and I thought, we had 5 different programs. One of them was a Stanford University program, another came from MIT, and we were supposed to figure out which of these methods would help these children learn. And I tried that for a week, and nothing was working. So I took them outside, and I drew circles in the dirt, and I said, I want you to put 2 parts of your body inside the circle and 1 part outside. And we tried that. And I would pat them on the head and tell them they were doing great, and then we'd say, I want to put 3 parts in and only 1 part out. And we started working on numbers, and it worked for them. And then finally, we did the circles on pieces of paper in my classroom, and they were able to translate putting dots into the circle into numbers. And the kids in that class started testing out, because there were tests, so they could take them and go back to their normal classrooms. And my kids started testing out. So the district came, and they were so excited, and they said, tell us, which one of these programs is working, and which one do you like best? And I said, that's all over there in the closet. I don't use that stuff. It doesn't work. And I told them what I did. And they moved over in a corner and had a little conference for a minute, and they finally say to me, you're doing good work, but you can't do that. This program is funded by federal money, and we only get paid if you use it, and you can't do that anymore. And I said, but my kids tested out. And they said, yeah, we understand that, but you have to go back to using this program or that program, not the one that works. And 2 days after that happened, the Air Force recruiter called and said, something magical has happened. You got accepted to OTS, except there's a mistake because you're going into aircraft maintenance, and we don't have women in aircraft maintenance. And I said, okay, and he said, give me a day and I'll call and find out what you're really gonna do, and I'll call you back. And he did, and he said, no, you're gonna be an aircraft maintainer. It's a brand new program, and you're one of the people that's gonna go into it. Give me a second, I gotta catch up in my notes to where I am now. General Jenny Holm, who is a friend of mine, or was a friend of mine, wrote a book called Women in the Military, and she documented that in 1972 and 73, the Air Force decided that it wanted to increase the utilization of women across career fields. You could be a supply person, you could be in personnel, you could be a finance person, but we had dozens of career fields that were closed to women, just because it had always been that way. And the Air Force decided it was going to be different, so it started a different program. And it's not uncommon today to see women mechanics or women in civil engineering, just as it's not uncommon to see women astronauts or women senators. But it was different at the time. The women's liberation movement was starting to blossom in the early 70s, and they were identifying both social and workplace barriers that impeded the inclusion of women in both the military and the civilian workforce. Let me tell you about some of those barriers, because they were real, and they were institutional barriers, deliberate barriers. Until 1968, only 2% of the military could be women. No woman could hold the rank of general. There could only be one woman colonel in each military service, and she had to be the director of women in that service. And if she didn't retire from that job and went back to another job, she reverted to her rank as a lieutenant colonel. I told you about women being admitted in the 70 school year to ROTC, but it was 10 years more before women could compete regularly for ROTC scholarships. Until 1973, male civilian spouses of military women could not earn the status of dependent. You see, by definition, a man surely wouldn't want to be a dependent. But being a dependent meant access to health care and housing and all kinds of other issues. And an Air Force lieutenant filed suit in a case that went to the Supreme Court. She was represented by the Southern Poverty Law Center, who argued the case, and the not as yet notorious RBG also represented her as part of the ACLU. She won her case. The Supreme Court said that the military's benefit policy was unconstitutional. There was no reason why military wives needed benefits like health care any more than military husbands. It may surprise you to know that it wasn't until 1976 that women could go to the military academies. Annapolis, West Point, the Air Force Academy were closed to us. And it wasn't until 1976 that women became pilots. I think it's important to keep that historical perspective to appreciate the far-sighted women and men who challenged the system and championed full integration and utilization of women in the military. So in 1972, I reported to Lackland Air Force Base for 90 days of intensive training, learning everything I needed to know about being an Air Force officer. The women in my class also took classes in how to apply makeup. I don't know. The guys were out on the shooting range and most of us wanted to be out there with them, but that was the Air Force priority. At the halfway point in our training of that 90 days, our upper class graduated, and we became the upperclassmen, and some of us got officer trainee or OT rank, and I was made an OT lieutenant colonel. My section commander took me aside and said, if you do well, other women will get the same opportunity, and if you fail, they won't. I can remember to this day nodding and appreciating what he was telling me and resenting it at the same time. I had plenty of pressure in my life at that time. I didn't need any more. But you know, I really did need to know that if I didn't do well, that my success or failure would be generalized across an entire gender. And it was important, and it was a responsibility I accepted. And I didn't fail, and on July 13th, 1972, I became an Air Force second lieutenant. I was in that first group of second lieutenants who became aircraft maintainers, and I went to Keynote Air Force Base in Illinois, and I asked some of the men who were in our class where I could learn my job best. And to a man, they said, on the flight line. You want to be on the flight line. I said, okay. So in 1973, it was February, I reported to Pease Air Force Base, right on the coast, pretty cold. And I talked to the squadron commander in charge of the flight line maintenance section, and I said, I'd really like to work on the flight line. And he said, okay, but the deputy commander for maintenance has to approve that. So I walked across the hangar, I reported in and saluted, and the colonel asked me some questions. So one of the things he asked me was, where did I want to work? And I told him I wanted to work on the flight line. He stood up and came out from behind his desk, and he walked over to me, because I was still standing. He'd never invited me to sit. And he put his arm around my shoulder. I don't think he knew that he was being patronizing, but he walked me over to the window, and he said, look outside. It's about 20 degrees today, and the wind chill's 10 degrees. And the work is dirty, and the language is terrible, and it's a man's world. And I said, I understand that, sir, but that's still where I'd like to learn my job. And he looked at me and he said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a week. And when you get tired of being out there, you come back and I'll find you a nice desk job. And I thanked him, and I walked across the hangar, and I thought to myself, it'll be a heck of a lot colder and dirtier than it is today for me to come back and tell you I can't have this job. 6 months later, he left, and I was still on the flight line. I guess there's a moral there. So, I was the assistant officer in charge of the tanker branch. We had 30 aircraft, 100 personnel, and I, along with the captain I worked for, was responsible for ensuring our troops produced quality maintenance every day. I loved the responsibility and challenge. However, there were still things I needed to do to figure out before I could be accepted as a full-up maintenance officer and leader. I was still the first and only woman in aircraft maintenance in our wing, and it wasn't going to be easy. Let me start with the uniform. The men had heavy-duty fatigue uniforms which helped keep them warm and resisted damage from fuel and hydraulic fluid and grease and other flight line fluids. I had a women's standard lightweight cotton shirt and pants which basically disintegrated when they got around any of those fluids. The guys had bulky, warm cotton parkas with big, bulky hoods. If you've ever seen a show about service in the North Pole or Antarctica, you've seen those hoods. The women at Pease wore nylon parkas. They were from Sears. They were adequate. They kept us warm from building to building, but they weren't for the flight line. See, nylon generates static electricity, and we worked with fuel and liquid oxygen and liquid nitrogen and other things, and you could be generating static electricity. My authorized fatigue footwear were low-quarter leather shoes. They weren't warm, and they weren't safety shoes. And in our industrial environment, I should have had safety shoes, but we couldn't find anybody who made them in women's sizes, because we didn't have women in these traditionally male career fields. I was the first woman our troops had ever seen as a leader in aircraft maintenance, and they were skeptical at best, and at worst, they were mumbling they weren't going to work for a woman. So on another cold day in February, I drove out in my truck to the flight line, and I stopped where a young man that I knew was one of the ringleaders of this "I'm not going to work for a woman" was beginning a pre-flight on a tanker. That takes 5 or 6 hours, depending on how much you have to fix on the airplane. I got out of my truck, and I said, I hear you're really good at this, and I'd like to learn how to do a pre-flight. Do you mind if I watch you? And he very carefully looked me up and down and figured I'd last about 15 minutes out there the way I was dressed, and said, sure. I mean, what else was he going to say? I ranked him. I mean, he had to let me watch. I followed him around, and carried his TO, carried his toolbox, and we talked about the things that we were doing. Eventually, the aircrew came out, and they did their own pre-flight inspection. He signed off the aircraft forms, and I signed my first exceptional release. And that means that the aircraft is airworthy, and the officer who signs that is certifying that if something happens to that aircraft, it's all on you. And as they taxied out and we tidied up the parking spot that the plane had been on, I tossed the keys to my truck to this young sergeant and said, "Would you mind taking the truck back to the hangar?" And he looked at me like I was crazy because he knew I was frozen. And he said, "Sure." And he got in the truck and he drove away. And as soon as he was out of sight, then I walked in from the flight line because I couldn't feel my feet. And it was a clutch shift. And I was afraid I would run that truck into some other obstacle on the flight line. He came to my office a little bit later that day and he said, "Ma'am, if you really want to learn how to do a pre-flight, I'll teach you." And that was the end of the mutiny. My boss, my captain boss, I thought he was the meanest man in the Air Force. He said, "I want you to learn every inspection that these people do. Our crew chiefs do everything from pre-flight and post-flight inspections to tire changes to all kinds of things, and I want you to learn them." Okay. He said, "And then I want you to be evaluated by quality assurance inspectors the same way our crew chiefs are, and I expect you to pass." And I don't think I said okay. No other maintenance officer on the base did that. Nobody had ever asked him to. And I resented it at first, but it was the best gift I could have been given because my guys decided that quality assurance was not going to fail their lieutenant. They made sure I knew what I was doing. And it set the foundation for my success throughout my aircraft maintenance career because I really did know what happened day to day to make aircraft fly. It gave me confidence, and my bosses and my crew chiefs grew in their confidence of me too. And I think at the end of that time, I was finally a full up ground maintenance officer. We found a safety shoe manufacturer who makes shoes in women's sizes. We found somebody to cut down the parkas so we didn't freeze to death. We found somebody to make bunny boots so we were warm. And I can tell you that it was the most challenging part of my Air Force career because there wasn't anybody else to talk to. But somehow or other, I made it. So I moved from the tanker branch to job control, which was kind of the nerve center for both bomber and tanker maintenance, and we controlled a lot of the stuff that was happening, set the priorities. And civil engineers had to do something with an area outside one of the sides of the hangars. And there was a 10-foot wide trench that was about a football field long. And typically, before the trench was there, we put airplanes in both sides of the hangars. But we couldn't do that because they hadn't certified that it was okay to tow an airplane over that trench. Now, we'd driven trucks and other stuff over it for weeks, but we hadn't put an airplane in on that side. And every day, my boss would complain about, "You're not getting the airplanes in the hangar," because we had to take them around to the other side, and if that side of the hangar was full, we had to pull one out, pull the other one in, and pull the one we just pulled out back in for its own maintenance. It doubled our workload, and I got tired of it. And I thought, I'm getting paid to be a problem solver, I'll fix this. So I talked to one of my senior NCOs and I said, "I want to do a tow. We're going to tow a tanker across that trench and into that side of the hangar." A tanker is a 707 aircraft. It's bigger than the 737s that most of us routinely fly in. And the landing gear on it is taller by about 2 feet than I am. And he said, wisely, "Ma'am, I think that's a really bad idea, and I'm not going to supervise that tow." Well, I was tow supervised. Did I mention stupid? Yeah. And I said, "Okay, fine, I'll do it. I'll supervise the tow." We've got the aircraft hooked up, tow crew, tow vehicle pulls over across the trench, everything's going fine. And at the moment that those wheels crested the front of that trench, I had a vision in my mind, oh my gosh, that airplane could sink up to its belly. And I'm the one that's doing it. and it was too late to stop. And by the grace of God, the trench didn't give away. We put the airplane in. They said, do you want to do another one? I said, no, I don't think so. I found that senior NCO and I said, I was wrong and you were right. And then I waited for my boss to come in the next morning. And I told him what I'd done. And he had a few colorful words for me. And then he said, everybody is stupid sometimes. Don't make a habit of it. I've tried not to make a habit of it. I left there and went to a couple of other assignments and ended up in Omaha, Nebraska in Strategic Air Command. And I worked in an open bay, and there were pillars similar to these throughout the area where our desks were. And every day when I would go in, again, I'm the only woman, maintenance officer on the entire staff, and there would be a joke or a cartoon, either denigrating women, or if it hadn't been, the target hadn't been women, they would cross out whoever it was about and they would put the word women in. And I didn't know what to do about that. I knew if I reacted every day and made a fuss, that they would just label me as a radical feminist and put me off to the side. They wouldn't listen to me anymore. I also knew if I didn't say anything, that I was giving implicit permission for that kind of stuff to behave, that kind of behavior to go on. So I called a friend of mine, a mentor, and I highly recommend when you get out working, find a mentor, because they're priceless. And I explained the situation, and she gave me a suggestion. So the following Monday, I went into work, and this time I put the cartoon up. Actually, I didn't, I take that back. They did. And it said, if women are going to be pilots, I'm going to start carrying a parachute. Har har. And I went over and I crossed out the word women, and I wrote the word blacks in. And they came over and they looked at it and they said, you can't say that, and tore it down. And I said, why not? And they said, it's discrimination. And I said, precisely. And that was the end of that. It was just a change in perspective for them and a way for me to point out that that change needed to happen without it being really heavy-duty stuff for them. At another assignment, I was again in job control. We were launching most of our tanker fleet toward Europe. It was heavy-duty action, and we were working really hard. And our wing commander, the senior officer on the base, came up to job control and stepped in and said, Kris, let's go check the maintenance on the flight line. And the leer on his face left no doubt in my mind, or the mind of my troops, what he really wanted to check out. But he was in charge. And without making a scene, I had no choice. I got my coat on. It was winter again. We drove out in the snow to an access road far away from aircraft and far away from any personnel. And he proceeded to tell me that my officer performance report was on his desk, my OPR, my yearly evaluation. And he said, you know, if I send that forward to our general up the chain, you'll get a regular commission. I'm sure you will. And it was a measure of merit, and it was something that mattered to me. And he said, but I haven't decided if I want to do that yet. And then he said, you know, I find you really attractive. And I think we have a special chemistry. And I'd like to have an affair. You don't get time out at that period when that happens to you. There's no time out to say, I gotta go think about this, can I get back to you? I remember I said, what about your wife? And he said, I've never forgotten this. This is 40 years ago, I've never forgotten it. It may be morally irresponsible, but it adds a certain spice. And I thought to myself, I was looking for a job when I found this one. And I told him that I came from a very conservative family and a very conservative state, and we didn't have affairs. And he shook his head, and he reached across the across the seat, and grabbed me in an embrace, pulled me to him, gave me a full lip kiss, shook his head, and drove me back in. And that was the end of that. That kind of stuff can happen even today, and thank goodness we now have a movement called B2. And people who have that happen to them have a chance to articulate it and have some action taken. I just kept wondering what signals I was sending to this guy about special chemistry. I mean, I only talked to him about aircraft. One night we were at the officers club, and there were 8 women officers on the base, and we started comparing notes. And it turned out, of the 4 senior colonels on the base, every lieutenant and captain there at that table had been approached by one or more of them with similar stories about, hey, do this and I'll give you this, you give me this and I'll give you that. It doesn't happen like that in the Air Force anymore, but there weren't very many women, and at the time it did seem to happen. We've made some changes, Me Too has made some changes. When you get out in the workforce, you'll make changes too. And I'm eager for that to happen for you. To skip through my notes, I decided not to read to you, so I'm having to jump in a little bit, a little ahead. So I got my first squadron command. I was in the Philippines, and it was a pretty good squadron. And I thought I was a pretty good commander. And then I met Captain Danny Steele, and he was the best leader and the best maintainer I ever worked with. He was so smart and so gifted, and he had a connection with everybody he met. Do you know people like that? You just reach out and they connect with you, or a professor that inspires you. Danny was like that. And we had an inspection team in, and they were called maintenance, standardization, and evaluation, and they were to check how well we did things, from servicing to changing a tire to changing an engine. It was a 10-day inspection. And each day they gave us a list of who they wanted to inspect. Do we want tasks? And it was the first day, and we'd just gotten our list, and I wasn't happy. The guy was a good mechanic, but he had some behavioral problems, and I thought, oh no, we're in trouble. And I was walking down the hallway, and Captain Steele said, ma'am, what's the matter? We stepped into my office, and I told him what was on my mind, and he said, he's a good mechanic, but if he sees that frown on your face, he's gonna think you're worried that he can't do the job. And I thought, I'm the superior, you're the subordinate, and you're teaching me more leadership than I ever think about. You're right. We walked down the hallway, I saw the guy, he looked at me, and he kind of frowned and hung his head, and he said, I guess you heard who they're gonna check first. And I had a big grin on my face, and I walked over and I patted him on the shoulder, and I said, you can change a tire better than anybody in the squadron. They couldn't have picked a better guy for us. Why do you think I'm grinning? You know, he went out and aced that inspection, and 2 more later the same day. And that feeling spread across the squadron, and we got an unprecedented, outstanding rating from that team. Subordinates are pretty smart guys and gals, and it pays to listen to them if you can. I'm trying to not talk forever. I had a series of assignments, and finally I got assigned to Hill Air Force Base. For the first time ever in my career, I was in my home state. And I was the director of aircraft maintenance at Hill Air Force Base, and I liked it. And one night, I just gotten home, it was, I don't know, 6 o'clock at night, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and a voice said, General Facilio would like to speak to you. And I thought, General Facilio was my 4-star boss. He lived in Ohio, and he never called just to chat and see how things were going. And I thought, oh no, what have we done? And he got on the phone, and the first thing he said was, Kris, are you standing at attention? And I looked down and I said, yes sir, I am. And he paused for a minute and he said, "It is my honor to tell you that the President of the United States will tomorrow put your name in nomination for promotion to General in the United States Air Force." I have nothing to say. I'm dumbstruck. And like 30 seconds go by. And the first thing I think is, "Are you sure?" Of course he's sure, he wouldn't have called me. And I just can't say anything. And after about that 30-second pause, he laughed and said, "I do believe I've surprised you." And I said, "Yes, sir, but it's a delightful surprise, and thank you so much," and got off the phone. And then I'm sure he called everybody I'd ever known in the world. My family lives in Utah, and I was the first Utah-born and raised woman to ever make Brigadier General rank in the United States Air Force. So it was front page news. And my family, for the first time, got to directly share that experience. And it makes me smile to this day. It was a wonderful experience. I promise I'm almost done. In closing, I want to share with you the words of a great American hero and leader, Senator John McCain. He said, "I have had the great good fortune to spend 60 years in the employ of our country, defending our country's security, advancing our country's ideals, supporting our country's indispensable contributions to the progress of humanity. It has not been perfect service, to be sure, but I have tried to deserve the privilege, and I have been repaid 1,000 times over with adventures and discoveries, with good company, and with the satisfaction of serving something more important than myself." BYU's honors program has prepared you to become broad thinkers, creative problem solvers, and innovative leaders. And my wish for each one of you is that the pathways of your life lead to challenge, to serving something more important than yourself. If I may paraphrase an Irish blessing, may the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. And when your road diverges, as it certainly will, may you occasionally choose the road less traveled, just for the pure adventure of it. Thank you, good luck, and Godspeed.